Hello, welcome. My name is Riki Graves, and I'm mom to an infant heart transplant recipient and I also work at a transplant center in Houston. I'd like to welcome you to the 2023 Pediatric Transplant Conference session on advocacy and continuous distribution of transplant organs. This session will help explain the concept of continuous distribution of organs, which plays a critical role in improving access to life-saving transplants for our pediatric patients. I'd like to say thank you to our sponsors, CareDx, Natera, Enduring Hearts, and Stanford Children's Hospital. Today's session is 30 minutes, and towards the end of the event, we'll have time for questions and chat. Please leave questions in the Q&A section. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce James Alcorn, Senior Policy Strategist with the United Network for Organ Sharing. James has been a leader in organ transplant policy for more than a decade. He is responsible for the policy department and strategy for the nation's transplant system. At UNOS, James has been responsible for every aspect of how the country determines how to allocate resources in accordance with federal laws and regulations. James is considered an expert in the management and operations of policy department within a federally contracted healthcare system. In this role, he's responsible for engaging with policy oversight bodies, boards of directors, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and Health Services and Resources Administration. James supports the public and transplant community in participating in the policy development process. I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, James.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak at your conference today. I've really enjoyed listening to all of the sessions so far. This has been a wonderful conference, and I appreciate the invitation. My name is James Alcorn, as Riki mentioned, and I work at the United Network for Organ Sharing, and I'm here to talk to you about continuous distribution of organs, or how it is that we actually match organs with candidates in need of a transplant. Now, before I begin, I must acknowledge that this presentation and my work is funded by a contract with the federal government through HRSA, or the Health Resources and Services Administration. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk about three different things today. One of those is, what is continuous distribution? Second, what does this mean for pediatric candidates in particular? And then third, how can patients and families help develop this system? So last year, there was over 42,000 transplants in this country, and there's over 100,000 individuals that are waitlisted or waiting for an organ transplant. And so somehow we need to match the thousands of donated organs with the other thousands of individuals that are waiting for a transplant. And there's lots of different goals that we're trying to achieve when we are doing this. And ultimately, we're trying to find the right organ for the right candidate at the right time. And that's what continuous distribution is trying to do. So what is continuous distribution? As I mentioned, this is the method by which we are allocating organs, those donated organs, with individuals in need of a transplant. And so it's best understood by comparing the old system with the new system. The way that our current system worked for some of the organs, or our old system before continuous distribution, is that we would look at lots of different factors. Sometimes we call these attributes for candidates in need of a transplant. We would look at how sick a candidate is, or how long they can go without a transplant. We would predict how well somebody would perform after a transplant. We obviously are doing some biological matching, such as blood type, to make sure that the candidates are going to do well. We also look to see how old candidates are. Are you a pediatric or an adult? We look at how far away you are, so on and so forth. We have lots of different ways that we group and rank candidates. And what the old system does is we place candidates into these buckets. And then within these buckets, we rank candidates according to a series of different decisions. And sometimes a candidate that is in a higher bucket, if you will, was less sick than somebody that was in a lower bucket. And there wasn't really a way necessarily to jump between the buckets as fluidly as we would like. And so what we do in the new system is we take these same concepts. We still look at how sick somebody is, how well they're going to do after transplant, how far away they are from the donated organ, their blood type, so on and so forth, all the different issues that we look at. And what we do in this new system is we recognize that every individual is different, both the donor organ and the candidates in need of a transplant. And so what we do is we give every candidate an overall score. We call this your composite allocation score. And we use that to rank candidates from high to low on the wait list. And what this new system does is it erases all of those groups or the classifications and it considers all of these factors at the same time so that we can define a candidate's unique need for organs at the same time. Because ultimately, again, what we're trying to do is get the right organ to the right candidate at the right time. We're moving along with that. We recently implemented this for lungs. We're taking this system and we're implementing this for all of our organs. Kidney and pancreas are next furthest along. That's our largest organ system by far. And then after that, we have liver, intestines, and hearts, which are working their way through the development of this system. And we hope to be completely transitioned within several years. But what does this really mean from a practical perspective for people? One is that the system is going to be much more flexible. So we'll be able to make changes for candidates much more rapidly as clinical information is changing, as the science is evolving, as ethics change. We're able to change the system. One thing that I'm really concerned about and really happy about is that it's a much more equitable system. Because we're no longer grouping candidates into these different buckets, we can make a system so that no one factor will determine a candidate's placement on the waiting list. And finally, as I mentioned, this system is going to be much more agile. I know Joseph, who works with our board for many years, has been focused on making sure that we build a system that is able to be responsive to the needs of the community. And that's one of the key characteristics of this new system. Well, what does this mean for children? I'm happy to say that we do modeling for all of our policies before we put them in place. And recently, we've also engaged with MIT in their use of artificial intelligence to even better predict and more rapidly predict changes in policy. And all of the reports that are coming out really are kind of emphasized here on the screen for children, which is transplant rates for children in the lung system are going to be increasing. And that's what we're seeing right away after lung was implemented in March of this year, is that pediatrics rose to the top of the list. This was one of the goals that the lung community set out as they developed their system, and that pediatrics are now able to have greater access to transplants from donors across the country, which is one of the chief goals of developing that new system. So how do we do that? As I mentioned, we have lots of different factors that go into prioritizing candidates, and there's really a couple that help out pediatrics in particular, and I've highlighted them here in red. And let me explain the difference between some of these, and don't worry, I won't bore you with all of the different attributes that we have on the screen. The first one is that we wanted to prioritize pediatrics overall. So just right off the bat, if you are a candidate who is registered on the waiting list before your 18th birthday, then we want to give a priority to children. This is consistent with what federal law tells us, but it's also good practice because this helps out all candidates across the transplant system. Lung applied this priority for all donors and for all candidates. So you would keep this priority even after you turn 18. And as I said, Lung applied this priority for all donors. Kidney is expanding this from the donors for whom pediatrics receive priority right now. So they'll receive greater priority in the future, but not for all donors moving forward. And liver and heart and the other organs are still having these conversations, but overall, everybody has endorsed the idea that pediatrics should retain or have expanded access or priority in the new systems. And so what you see on this screen is one of the ways that we visualize this to folks. And as I mentioned, we create an individualized score for every candidate that's on the waiting list. And so here on the screen is just one way that we visualize it to committees that are working on this, is that you can see every candidate gets a few points for all these different topics or attributes that we have in the system. And that big navy bar on top is the big bump that we give to pediatrics in the lung system. And as you can see, it's a pretty significant bump, which means that pediatric candidates will receive priority really across the country, and it will raise them up to the top of the system. The other thing that's new in allocation, or at least in lung allocation, is that we recognize that pediatrics typically are also some of our smaller candidates. And as I like to point out to folks, you can't take the lungs from a 7-foot basketball player and put them into a little child. And vice versa, you can't take the lungs from a child and put them into a 7-foot basketball player. And so we give priority to those candidates who have an especially difficult time receiving transplants because of their size. So this extends no matter what your age is, but we recognize that this will also help out most pediatric candidates who are typically going to be shorter in size, especially infants and or young pediatric candidates. And so one of the things that we do with, as I mentioned, whenever we are developing these organ allocation policies, is we're trying to predict how they will perform before we implement them. And this here is just one of the dashboards that we utilized with MIT in terms of our predictions. And so we looked at the pediatric transplant rate as we are developing all of these policies. This here is just a sample slide. Please don't quote me on these specific attributes or statistics. But what I wanted to let you know is that as we are developing the kidney and the pancreas systems, one of the things that the committee looked for was that pediatric candidates will have at least as much access as they do in the current system, but actually they wanted to have increased access in the current system. We're awaiting those modeling results and we'll receive those in July, but all predictions indicate that pediatric candidates should have greater access in the kidney system moving forward. So how can I influence this policy? And this is the part where I love talking with patients and their families and their advocates, because this is something that, as we have developed continuous distribution, it's not just a change in how we allocate organs, but it's also a change in how we develop organ allocation policy. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was make sure that we were developing policies in a way that patients and their families and their advocates were able to have meaningful participation in the development of these policies. For too long, a lot of our policy development really required you to have a pretty substantial understanding of the science and the clinical background to be able to influence the policies. And we recognize that there's a lot of values-laden decisions that go into this that everybody can have everybody has an opinion about, and that's really important to the development of these policies. So one of the things that we did is we developed what we call a values prioritization exercise. And I saw earlier in the agenda, there was a discussion about, receiving your patient input and shared decision making. And that's so important to policy development as well. And so anybody can have an opinion about what topics are most important when allocating organs. Should it be medical urgency or pediatric priority? Should it be medical urgency or efficiency in the system? Should it be pediatric priority or placement efficiency or efficiency of the system? You don't have to be a clinician to be able to have an opinion on these things. And so we have done a few of these online exercises with the community to gather feedback as to what the community prioritizes when we are developing these systems. In just our last exercise, we had over 1,000 participants in it, and over half of them were non-clinicians. They were either recipients, candidates, their families, stakeholders, and folks along that nature. And we find that so valuable to us when we are trying to develop policies that reflect the values of the entire transplant community, because ultimately we're here to serve patients at the end of the day. And so we've done a few of these exercises. I encourage you to take a look at them online, and we'll be doing more of these over time. And I encourage any of you who have not yet had a chance to visit the OPTN website to do so and to participate in these exercises moving forward. And as I said, when we did this, we've done 4 of these so far. All of them came back that the community wanted to create a priority for pediatric candidates. There was almost nobody that said, that there shouldn't be priority for pediatrics. And these are the results just from the community in terms of how the community would rank those. The light blue one is actually what we implemented with the lung policy that went into effect earlier this year, and the other ones are still under development. But what it tells me is that the community values the priority for pediatrics and wants to see that continue in continuous distribution. The other thing that I would recommend is taking, as I mentioned, there's the OPTN website, and there's so much rich information on there. We have webinars on a regular basis to share information with professionals as well as patients and their caregivers. And I encourage you to attend those. We have really placed a great emphasis on making sure that patients understand how the system works, because ultimately, as I mentioned, we're here to serve patients at the end of the day. And so there's material that's on there specific for patients to understand how the system works. And in particular, moving forward, we want this to be a system where there's shared decision-making between patients and their caregivers and their clinical teams. And so there's information on there, whether you want to take a look at your own scores and how you might be ranked compared to the rest of the country. And I encourage you to have conversations with your transplant teams about this information and what that means in terms of your transplant plan and your care plan with your providers. As I mentioned, there's a lot of other information on there, and ultimately it's there to make sure that patients are informed about how they are impacted by the transplant policies, and also because we really need, not just want, but we need your help to developing these policies to make sure that ultimately they are reflecting the needs of the transplant community, especially patients at the end of the day. And that includes not just while we are developing those, but after the policies are implemented, talking with your transplant team about what this means for your specific care, but also if you have suggestions about how this should be improved moving forward, as we are constantly evolving these transplant algorithms and how we are matching candidates with donors moving forward. And with that, I'm happy to open this up for questions. I do appreciate the invitation to your conference. I've really enjoyed it so far. And with that, I'll turn it over to Riki.
Okay, we've got a few questions. First one, how is the system making sure that every child has a fair chance to receive a needed organ, regardless of urgency, location, socioeconomic status, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, as I mentioned, one of the things that we wanted to do, the lung is the first organ to be implemented. And for children, especially when you compare where they were on the match run previously compared to where they are now, pretty much children have risen up to the top. So no matter where you are in the country, children are receiving offers from around the country, regardless of their location, their medical urgency. Socioeconomic status is a little bit more complicated because there are issues impacting socioeconomic status to getting registered. But once you are registered on the waiting list, your socioeconomic status shouldn't be impacting your access, because pediatric candidates are brought up to the top of the match runs.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question, what can I do to help advocate for this continuous distribution system? I know you gave us some answers, but was there anything else that you would like to add on to this?
Yeah, thank you so much. So the first thing that I would recommend is talking with your transplant team. So we often ask members what they're hearing from their patients. We encourage them to go out to their patients and their caregivers to solicit feedback. So talk with your transplant team. The second is, if you want to be more direct, you can go straight to the OPTN website, we have a public comment system by which members or anybody in the community, really around the country or around the world, can go to our website and provide feedback on proposals that are either under development or headed to our board. You can just search for OPTN or public comment and you'll find that. But also we have meetings around the country twice a year. Patients are always welcome to attend that. And if you really want to get engaged, I will always encourage members and patients and their caregivers to join our committees. We have one on patient affairs and one on pediatrics that may be of special interest for those of you that are listening tonight.
Thank you. Okay, is there a concern that the emphasis on placement efficiency, specifically travel or proximity efficiency, could contribute to disparities in allocation?
That's something that we pay a lot of attention to. And so historically, that's been an issue that the OPTN has grappled with. And I will say that in continuous distribution, we're doing a lot of modeling to make sure that every candidate, no matter where they are registered or where they live, has equal access to transplantation. And so the level of placement efficiency is, one of those things that can impact that. And so that's an area that we have closely monitored as we are modeling this.
I agree. Okay. And then the next two questions kind of go together. How might changes in the OPTN, such as being potentially administered by another contractor, affect this? And with the recent announcement regarding these changes with UNOS, would all this work on continuous distribution to be changed to another system?
Well, I would sure hope not on the second one. So I don't know exactly what the federal government will do with the OPTN contracts. I will tell you that we at UNOS and at the OPTN, we're very forward-looking in terms of this. And so I think that the best way to serve the community is to continue work on really transformative, changes such as this with continuous distribution. This particular project has received a lot of accolades from HRSA, from HHS, from lots of different sources. So I don't expect that we'll be reversing course on continuous distribution, no matter what happens with the OPTN contracts.
Okay. And I noticed in the chat that Ansara dropped the link for the public comment for the OPTN regarding this topic. So with that, I think that unless there are any other questions, or is there anything that you might want to touch on that you felt like you didn't finish? We have a couple minutes.
Yeah, the only other thing that I would mention here is, again, I really encourage you to talk with your transplant providers about these changes. So ultimately, we're here to serve patients, and it's through conversations with the community that we can best develop these policies. I think that from a pediatric perspective, pediatric patients and their caregivers should be very pleased with the direction that continuous distribution is taking. As I mentioned, so far, all of the predictions, what we've predicted for lung was that pediatric candidates would rise to the top, and that's what we're seeing since lung has been implemented. And that's so far what we are predicting for the other organs, though those are less far along in development. So I encourage you to talk with your transplant provider about these changes. I'm always happy to answer any questions about continuous distribution. Joe and Melissa know that I love to talk about it ad nauseum. And finally, if you are really interested, please go to the OPTN website for public comment, or we would love to have you as a member of one of our committees as well.
We definitely need more pediatric representation, and I appreciate the fact that there has been new pediatric representation joining committees and the board. So I'm happy about that. One thing that I would like to ask is, since we did a record number of transplants last year in the United States, did you see that same number for pediatrics, and do you expect that number to keep rising with this new policy?
So I don't know the number for pediatrics off the top of my head. I probably should look that up before today. But yes, all indications are that the system is continuing to grow. The need for transplant obviously continues to grow, but also the number of donors continues to rise as well, which should result in record transplants again.
That's great. I agree, and I think if we can keep encouraging living donors as well as people to sign up to be donors, with deceased organs that works also. So I saw a lot of good stuff going on this month with Donate Life Month, and I'm excited about that. I'm really happy to see that going on, and I appreciate you being there. Getting a lot of compliments on your talk. So it looks like we are at the end of our session, and I would like to thank everyone who attended, and this has been recorded, so you will be able to share it with your friends and colleagues for anyone who was interested. I want to say a big thank you to James for joining us and answering all these challenging questions. Also, thank you to our sponsors, CareDx, Natera, Enduring Hearts, and Stanford Children's Health. My name is Riki Graves, and with that, I will sign off. Have a great evening.